All right. So on into costs. So we're trying to figure out how do costs work into our economic equations. There's two sides to cost, folks. One is the cost it takes you to pay for everything that you're going to use. And then the variable in there is the production, right? Because remember, when you produce something, you can always change how much you're going to produce in any one given time frame. All right? So the costs tend to be how much you have to pay to, to hire workers and to buy raw materials and all that other business. But remember that you don't necessarily have to do that if you decide all of a sudden to shut your business down, right? I mean, that's...
Can't really make revenue that way.
True, but you can do it, right? Again, now we're looking at it purely from the cost side. So try to take the revenue portion of your brain and throw it away for a second, because all we're thinking about is money going out now, as opposed to money coming in. Now, before we jump into stuff, we have to get some definitions in here. It's always good to have some definitions and memorize some terms. So there are two types of costs when you are running a business. Explicit costs, these are the things that you expect, right? These are the things that you pay for. Whatever you have to write a check for, swipe a card for, do an electronic transfer for, pay cash for, whatever. Any of those things are explicit costs for your business. So, this is rent, this is utilities, this is wages, this is insurance, this is, raw materials, whatever you spend money on. Yeah, everything that goes on in there, all the things that you got to spend money on to run a business. And then obviously that list goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. All right? Now, economists, we also like to have other types of costs because we're into this sort of thing. And so other than explicit, there are implicit costs. And implicit costs are opportunity costs. So if you decide to run your own business, you could have chosen to do something else. If you had chosen to do something else other than run your own business, probably what would have you done? You'd have gotten a job, right, and go work for the man or the woman, whatever you want to call it, right? Or the thing, if that's who your boss is. I don't know. So the idea is that implicit cost is lost wages from the job you could have worked at. How's that? So economists don't just look at the money, they also look at how much you could have made on the opposite side of it, right? So this is directly analogous to opportunity costs, right? Because to choose to run your business, you are giving up the wages you'd earn being a worker. All right? So if there's two types of costs, and remember that kind of putting these things together, there are then also two types of profit. All right, revenue, unfortunately, there's really only one way you make revenue, folks. That's price times quantity, period. So profit accounting profit, this is the profit that you're used to dealing with, right? This is total revenue minus your explicit costs. In other words, total revenue is the amount of dollars that came into your business. Explicit costs are the dollars that went out of your business, okay? Straight accounting profit, whether or not the ledger has a number, a positive number in the profit column at the end of the month or not. That's accounting profit. Are we in an accounting class, folks?
No.
No. Okay, so this profit, it's nice, but we really don't care about it. Okay? What we really care about, because we're in an economics class, is economic profit. Go figure. And when you are calculating economic profit, you're still going to, subtract your explicit costs, but now you're going to take into account your opportunity costs, the lost wages you could have earned. Right, so the only difference between these two equations, or these two concepts, right, so start with your total revenue, subtract your explicit costs, but then also subtract your implicit costs. Perhaps. All right. Obviously, from this point in time, from now on, whenever I say the word profit, your goal is to think this word, economic profit. All right? So if I tell you that someone is making zero economic profit, do not think that they're not making any money. Okay? They're just making what they expect to earn if they had gone out and just gotten a job. All right? So when you start running your own business, this is something you should do, right? If your own business is not making you more money than what you expected to make if you just went out and got whatever job you could get, then your business is not doing a good enough job, all right?
So you haven't bettered yourself in any way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, running a business is going to, earn you $50,000 a year from your business, but if you could have gone out and gotten a job for $50,000 a year, basically you're breaking even. And for some people that's a big deal because they're like, well, I don't want to be working for the man and I want to be my own man and so I want a woman or whatever, you're my own thing. And so I'm going to run my business, and if I'm running my business and making $50 grand a year, I'm happy. And other people will say running your own business is a pain in the, it's a difficult job. And that it's not worth the 50 grand that I'm making. I would rather just go get a $50,000 a year job so that I could go home when I'm done with my work and not have to work more, right? I mean, those sorts of things are what's going on. Now, the key for you guys is remembering when I say profit, I am always talking about economic profit, all right? So again, you could be making an economic loss, but still be making positive accounting profits, right? So the example I use is the farmer example in my own family. I have my grandfather was an immigrant, came over from Germany. He had a second-grade education. He was a farmer. How much do you think he expected to make on his farm every year? Enough to get by with the family. So he's thinking, if I make $15,000 a year from this farm, I did really well, because he'll be able to pay his mortgage for his farm. He'll be able to put food on and potentially even buy his kids clothes, right? And that's the way it worked. Now, 2 generations later, my nephew, who has now inherited all of the farms from our family that we have accumulated over the years, right? So my father had 2 brothers and a sister, and his family, my mom's side of the family, had 3 sisters. They all had land. All of that land all filtered down to one nephew, right? He's got a whole ton of land. He also went to college, went and got a master's degree in agricultural production, right? Yeah, so I mean, he got himself educated on running a farm. He's got 3,000 some odd acres of land at the moment, and he's got a serious education. How much do you think he expects to make from his farm? 15 grand a year?
No.
No. He's expecting to make, 6 figures from his farm, right? Because if he went out and got a job and worked for, say, Dow Chemical in designing new seed corn or whatever, he'd expect to get paid 6 figures. So if his farm isn't making him 6 figures, he's pissed, right? Now, he may have seasons where he does not make economic profit, where his farm only makes him, say, $60,000 or $70,000 a year. He has an economic loss because he had to subtract that $100,000. But that doesn't mean he's going out of business. It just means he's pissed, right? So when I say that people have an economic loss, don't think accounting loss, which means they're going out of business. They can't afford to pay their bills. That's not necessarily the case. They just can't necessarily live at the expected level that they're used to. And for some people, that may be, yeah, I got to shut down, right? Because if they don't expect to make a lot because maybe they don't have a really good education, that's the way it works, all right? So the key, though, is please realize when I say the word profit, I will try as many times as I can to say economic in front of it. And you guys should now know what that means. All right? All right, so that sets the table for definitions on what profit is. All right, so we've got some definitions. Now let's actually start doing something. All right, so you decide to run your own business. Well, okay, so the first thing we want to analyze is the production side of it. All right, so when you start your own business, you're probably going to have to hire workers at some stage. But when you start your own business, do you necessarily hire people right off the bat?
No.
No, you may just run it on your own, in the beginning, right? Once you get to that point where you are getting past your expectations, then you start thinking, ooh, I need to hire people. Or perhaps you're not meeting your expectations and you think I need more people to do it. All right, so let's consider the car wash example. So this is one of my favorite stories because it's just a great story. And it's almost true. I'm only embellishing a little, but bear with me to some degree. All right? So, one of the things you have to decide when you start doing your company is figuring out how much do your workers produce, right? And you want to know how much does each person that I hire add to my business, all right? So, a couple of years ago, it's probably more like 4 or 5 now, I was talking to the pastor of my church, and he was telling me that we were having some money problems. Go figure, right? Any charitable organization will start every conversation with that. So he was saying, we need, a few $1,000s to fix the leak in the roof. We can't afford it because we had to fix the leak in the basement already, and all of our building funds were appropriated for this year. And he's like, we need someone to generate donations. And I said, oh, well, tell you what I'll do. I'll start a car wash. Right? So car wash for my church. Great idea. So what I did is I said, okay, I am going to be a car washer. And unfortunately, the weekend that I decided to be the car washer, I asked my wife if she was going to be available.
Of course not.
No, she had other things to do that Saturday, and she was like, no, I'm sorry, I can't do this. And I said, okay, fine, I'll just do it on my own. So, I went out there. I had a friend who had a mechanic shop that had a hose and a bucket, and he's like, sure, go ahead, I'll write off all your expenses on my taxes anyway, so just, run your car wash right here in my parking lot, and anything you make, donate to your church. There you go, no problem. Perfect. So I put out a little sign, up in front of the road and on the back of the road and said, car wash, $5 donation accepted, stop on over and I'll wash your car for you. So how well do you think I did? Yeah, I didn't do so well. And so I actually washed a whopping 6 cars in my 4, 5, or 6 hour shift, however long I ended up sitting out. It was a nice day, so I didn't mind, right? You're hanging out in the sun, and it's, it was fun, right? So I charged him $5, and I washed 6 cars. So I showed up at church on Sunday, the next day, and I handed the pastor $30, and he said, so imagine normally when you do this sort of thing and you hand somebody $30, they're like, wow, great, thanks. But this is a charitable place, right? So when you hand them $30 for nothing, what do? Wow. Woohoo! Yeah, $30, woohoo! He's like, now we're, $970 away from our fixed roof, right? But at the same time, he's going, there's only one of you, Why didn't you get your wife to help you? And I'm like, she was busy. I'm not going to tell her what to do. And he's like, well, but next week she'll be available, right? And I'm like, well, she should be. And he's like, well, you're not going to stop, are you? And I was like, well, of course not. Exactly. So next week, I was like, okay. I hired my first worker, and it was my wife. Granted, this is all volunteer work, so it wasn't like I was paying her a whole lot. But we now had to work as a team.
Now you got 12 cars.
Well, now think about this, right? I put out the signs were already out there, but this time, I still did all the washing. What did my wife do to attract more customers this time?
Stood out in a bathing suit.
Heck yeah, she was bam chicka bam, you know, I made a second sign and she was walking. We were young then, okay? So it was she was out there selling it, right? And not only did I double my production, but I actually did a little bit better than doubling my production because I got more people to show up. We actually washed 14 cars that day. And when we had a big, huge, long line of cars, which happened all at once, she put the sign down and actually came in and helped me wash, right? So it wasn't like she was just the bunny out walking around, right? Although I did cat whistle a few times, perhaps. But you want to stay married to some degree. But so we did really well, and we showed up on Sunday the next day at church, handed the pastor $70 this time. What did the pastor say?
Even more.
Oh, this is more than double. Wow. And of course, the pastor knows nothing about economics, so what's he going to tell me to do?
Try again.
You're definitely going again, right? Because we haven't hit the $1,000 mark yet. So he's like, you're going to get more people to help you, right? And I was like, well, my brother lives in town. So what did I do next weekend?
Hired your brother.
Heck yeah! I pulled in my brother. And my brother and I, living together in the same city, so we'd known each other fairly well. And of course, we tried to pull in his wife, but they have 3 kids, so yeah, no. So, yeah, right, that would help. That would be the negatives, right? Anyways, we brought in my brother. Again, we sent my wife out to do the signage. My brother and I did the collecting of money and the washing of cars, and we were both very organized, very efficient. I mean, we worked hard. Right? We made sure that cars got washed, they got washed efficiently, and there weren't lines. I mean, if there were lines, my wife would come back and help, right? She was very amenable to working with her hands if necessary, I swear. And so
I guess we're getting to the not too portion.
Anyways, we actually washed in one day 24 cars. Right? Yeah. I mean, we were a well-oiled machine. Worked like a charm, right? No problems anywhere. Everything was great. And we showed up at church the next day, and this time, instead of just giving him $70, we gave him, what is that, $120? $120, right? And the pastor's is like, oh. I mean, he's seeing more than a new roof, right? He's seeing new church bells. He's seeing a new parking lot. And I'm like, hello? We have... Yeah, exactly. It's like, who's doing the work for all that? And he's like, whoa.
How come he wasn't washing? Yeah.
Well, because it was Saturday. He was writing the sermon.
There you go.
All right. So, of course, when I gave him the money, what did he tell me to do next week?
Do it again.
Well, of course. Come on. I mean, it's not like he's paying for any of this stuff. And we need to find more people. And, of course, next week, my brother's kids were actually spending the weekend with my parents. So his wife had no excuse. I mean, she was now available and very happy to help, right? So I hired my sister-in-law for the fourth week. And again, I mean, we're still family. We're all still nicey to each other. And we did good work. We had now 2 women, very young, walking around, helping. And when one of them couldn't, shine the appropriate sign, they would come back and help wash or collect money and get cars going through the system. And again, trying to keep things moving as quickly as we could. We were quite happy. We still saw increases, and we actually washed 32 cars in one weekend, right? 1 6 to 8 hour shift, however long it was.
And then you went home and skipped church on Sunday because you were freaking exhausted.
No, you can't quite get away with that yet. Since we were young, we were always doing, of course. We celebrated the appropriate amount of money that we had earned for the church. So we showed up on Sunday and gave him $160. And again, the pastor was like, well, you can do this again. And I'm like, look, I'm not a family. my parents aren't going to do this sort of thing. And he's like,
Members of the church that will help.
exactly. So my pastor put out in the bulletin a request for people to come in and help with the car wash.
Couldn't have done that on week 2, huh?
Well, that would have had to have been planned, right? He was always writing the sermon on Saturdays, so So, but anyways, after a month, he finally figured out that he could add something to the bulletin, and he got a fifth person to come out and help us the next week. Of course, this fifth week person,
Oh no.
wonderful, wonderful guy in our church, right? Great guy, love him. He's absolutely great, but this guy can barely walk. He can't see. I mean, he's got glasses. They kind of, they're telescopic in some fashion. He's a nice guy. Love the guy to death, but he came out to help us. And in the beginning, right, you can't give him the sign and ask him to take his shirt off. First of all, he had his pants pulled up to his, it was great. And so what we did at first was, again, sent the women out to do the advertising, the men did the work, and we were like, okay, you just collect the money and direct traffic to some degree. And, I mean, $5, it can't be that hard, right? But, of course, the first person who shows up and pays for a car wash has got $10, and he gives them the $10, and the old guy is like, thanks, and starts walking away. Well, he didn't even look at the money, just assumed he got a $5 bill because everybody's got the exact change for him, and he just started walking away. And of course, what did the person who was getting? Yeah, they're like, hello, where's my change? They're waiting, and so the cars are backing up, and we're washing further and further down, and we're like, hello, Frank, what are you doing? He's like, I don't know, I'm just waiting. I'm like, well, go collect. Why isn't the guy up in front leaving? And he's like, I don't know, he's yelling at me for some reason. And I'm like, well, okay. So, we walk over, and the guy's like, I gave him $10. And I'm like, okay. He's like, well, I didn't get my $5 back. I was like, oh. So, I'm like, Frank, we have change. He's like, yeah. Like, he couldn't see the 10 on the bill.
Oh, boy.
I was like, really? Frank, I mean, come on. But he's a 90-year-old guy, right? You don't.
So he pulled away a worker.
Exactly. So I made the change, and so the rest of the day, basically instead of us getting help from Mr. Mann, Frank was not doing. Yeah, we actually lost output on that last day. We dropped down to 30 on the fifth weekend. And once we finally saw a reduction in output, I came in and I gave the $150 to the pastor that weekend and said, I retire. I'm now too old for this, because working and babysitting was not really what I was up for. But this was a very good example of how production in a business works. Of course, now, in a business, don't think of these 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. Think of them in groups of, say, 10 or 20, right? Or think of them in terms of lines at a factory, right? So if you've got enough workspace in a factory to run, say, 5 different production lines at the same time, this one, the first line, may be, maybe 50-some-odd people, right, if the line is really big. And if you want to run 2 lines at the same time, when you hire the second line, you hire an entire 50 more people. And this production is not 6 units, but 6,000 or 14,000 of whatever it is that you're making, right? So it's a nice example in that it actually does apply, even though it doesn't look like it does. Now, the cool thing is that what you do with this is calculate something called the marginal output of your production. We are going to be talking about the term marginal on a regular basis, all right? And marginal is a relatively important term, so I want to make sure that you get it. So marginal how does an extra 1 input change total output? that's its standard definition. It's a very wordy definition, and it's not a very wordy concept. But the idea in this particular case is the input are the workers, right? Because those are the things that we're inputting into the system. The output is how many cars we're washing, okay? So what does an extra one input change to the total? So when I hired myself, I added me to the production. I inputted myself. What did output change from and to?
From 0 to 6.
From 0 to 6. So how much did I add to total output?
6.
6. So my marginal output was 6. Because that's how much I added to total output. Right? So now I added another input. I hired my wife. How much did my wife add to total output? 8, right? Because to get from 6 to 14, what do we need to add? We need to add 8. So my wife's marginal output was 8. And so what we see here is that marginal output is growing. Our growth is, we're growing, and not only are we growing, but we're growing on top of our growth, right? So then I hire my brother. How much does he add? 10. And then I hire his wife. How much does she add? 8. And of course, the last one? Negative 2. Yes, this is the only spot where economists will actually allow you to have negative numbers. It made me feel a little bit better after that whole elasticity debacle, right? So the question here is, where did the law of diminishing returns kick in? So one of the things that you will do when you run your own business is try and figure out when did the last unit that I added to my input, when did it start to decrease marginal output, not total output. All right? So the law of diminishing returns is where the marginal output shrinks. So here is where our marginal output fell. It went from 10 down to 8. This is where the law of diminishing returns kicked in. Please note, what happened to total output in that instance?
It still went up.
It still went up, right? So total output is still going up. It's just that it didn't go up as much. All right? So the law of diminishing returns is when marginal output starts to decrease. That's the book definition. Or when the growth of total output slows. So it's whenever total output doesn't grow as much as it did the worker before them. That's the worker that is experiencing the law of diminishing returns. And a lot of times, folks, this is where a business, if they were actually paying their workers to work, this is where they start saying, here's the magic point, right? This is where I start laying people off. Obviously, this fifth worker, even if you're working for free, this is the worker that you would lay off, right? So if I were to actually do this car wash again in the 6th week, I would kindly tell Frank that his services wouldn't be required. But since I'm not paying my sister-in-law anything, I would still bring her in, even though technically she doesn't add as much to the system as her husband did before her, right?
You wouldn't know that.
Right. Well, I mean, if I showed him this, he would.
You wouldn't know that until after.
Well, very true. And this is it. But this is exactly what businesses do as they hire and lay people off, right? Is they start looking at these kinds of tables, right? I mean, they're definitely looking at charts that say, okay, when I hired the next 20 people, what happened to our total production in the next, production cycle, whatever the cycle is, whether it's 2 weeks, a month, even if it's measured in days. That's definitely something they're doing. Because what do they want to make sure? They want to make sure they're not losing money, right? This is what you start looking at, all right? Now, that's the production side of it. Again, the reason why this example works really well is because all of my workers are getting paid 0. So at this stage, you hire as many workers as you can get as long as total output goes up, right? But In normal business, is that the way it works?
I bet you would have taken a fifth person if they were 20 years old and had all their faculties.
You bet, because the number probably would have increased, right? As long as the number's going up in a volunteer event, you're going to put more in. That's the way it works, right? But eventually, even in a volunteer event, you're going to get to that person who eventually makes your total output go down. I mean, that eventually you're going to get to the point where everybody's just going to sit around and talk instead of do anything. It's the nature of humanity. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing, right? All right, so I love that example. It's one of my favorites. All right, so that's the production side of it. Now let's look at the cost side of it. So now assume we do have to pay for our work. So again, remember in my example, right? Was I paying for all the water and the soap that I was using in order to do my car wash? No, again, that was all being donated for me, but theoretically, if I was really running a car wash, that would be an expense. Yeah, I mean, I would have to pay for the space that I was renting, I would have to pay for the hoses that I was using, have to pay for the soap, the water, everything, right? That's part of the deal. So, let's just jump right to it. So how do we define our total cost? First off, please let me, point out to you that I will very rarely write the word total cost. What will I normally write? Even easier, I'll just write TC. I'll abbreviate total cost with TC. The book actually does the same thing, which is nice. So the first thing that we do is that we want to start breaking our total costs up. So when we are done with a month, technically we can go back to our books and see how many checks did we write, right? How much did we pay all of our workers? How much resources did we have to spend on? How much rent did we have to spend? How much utilities did we have to buy? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that money, you just add it all up, right? And this is the money that's going out. Essentially, this is our explicit cost, how much money is flowing out of the system. So what we want to do is to start breaking this down a little bit, all right? And the way economists do this is they break total cost up into two separate categories, all right? Mathematically, this is how they do it. What do you think the VC stands for? Yeah, very good. So VC is variable cost. If this is variable, the other side of it's going to be fixed. Good try, though. Future is kind of up there. It's almost on the right track. Give yourself some space, because I want to define what these two things are and talk about examples. All right, so variable cost, right? Technically, what variable cost is the cost of production. What does it cost to actually make your product? All right? So what sorts of things do you have to spend on to force to actually make stuff?
Rent of the building that you're in.
Supplies, right? Supplies / resources. That's definitely one of them. What else do we got to pay?
Rent.
Well, now rent you're going to pay. If we produce nothing, are you going to still have to pay rent?
Yep. Yeah.
That's right. Rent doesn't go away even if you decide to shut the building down for a month, right? That's actually a fixed cost. Excellent. So this is the cost of having a business. And I'm going to put that in quotes. Basically, it's any cost you're going to have to pay even if you don't produce a damn thing. Okay? And things you're going to have to pay for, even if you produce nothing, would be stuff like rent. Now, what else is in there? What other things do you, again, these are all explicit costs. What do you write checks for? Wages. Definitely. That's definitely one of the factors, right? You got to pay your workers. Insurance, where does that fit in? Is it a fixed cost or is it a variable cost? You always have to pay for insurance. But if you fire all your workers and you're not producing anything, do you need to insure your workers? So are there two types of insurance? Yeah, some of it's variable, some of it's fixed. How do you know which one's which? It's kind of based on what you're insuring, but there's where you start getting into those fuzzy spaces where insurance could be fixed and it could be variable, right? And it's just a matter of how you... And again, it kind of depends on your business style as to which ones are which, right?
What if there's, say, a chemical accident? Would that be a variable cost, obviously, because you can't plan those, really?
Well, but that's what you have. That's what you have insurance for.
Okay.
I mean, so that might be
lost time.
This is just what we spent money on. So if something weird happened, then that's outside the picture, right? Right. So this is just what we know we're going to spend money on. What else is there? Machines. So what would that be? So let's put it inside of there, right? So there's hardware. I mean, that could be something in there, right? Office party material, right? So maybe every month you have a day where you have an office party. Is that fixed or variable? Very true, right? Or it could be depend who's the party for, right? I mean, if you have an office party every month, but the office party's for yourself only, that could be a fixed cost, because as long as the business exists, even if you produce nothing, you're still going to have the office party, right? You're just going to call it an office party. And probably what you do is that you charge the office party in your variable costs so that you can hide the fact that you're spending money on yourself, because when you spend your money on your business, you can hide it in your taxes.
And then you take everybody on planes and go to Cancun.
Shh, no, that doesn't really happen. All right. So what else is up here? What else? If you own land, what do you have to do? You have to pay taxes. Please don't forget your taxes. And taxes also fit over here on the cost of production side, right? Because when you hire workers, what do you have to do? You have to pay unemployment taxes. You have to pay payroll taxes. All of those sorts of things actually are part of the cost of production, right? They can go in both spots, potentially. And this will rotate these things depending on whether or not they want to look good or bad, right? Because if you're trying to make it look like your business is not doing well, you try and throw as much of your money into fixed costs as possible, because then your variable costs look cheap, and this is now a business that's easy to be purchased by someone else, because there's not a whole lot of variable costs. You won't have to spend a whole lot. You'll have to put some down at the beginning and not have to worry about it later. But again, the concept is just here: variable cost, fixed cost. Again, it's a little wishy. I'm not going to ask you questions like, is this a fixed cost or is this a variable cost? Okay, that's not a quiz question, all right, just so that you know. But, so now we've got our costs and we've divided them up into two spots. So, if you want to see how much money you're really spending, do you look at the actual numbers in the books? If you're the CEO, do you actually look at numbers? Not really. What do you look at when you're a CEO? You look at graphs. You look at pictures. Because you're a CEO, that means you're too stupid to figure out what the numbers mean. All you can handle is the pictures. And they better look good. Colors, multiple colors. Okay, I don't really mean that, but... All right, so... we need graphs. You can't go too long in this class without drawing a graph. I mean, it makes me nervous when I don't. So I need to get back to a graph. So we want to try and graph these three concepts: total cost, fixed cost, and variable cost. And remember that this is an equation that governs everything. All right? So let's start with the easy stuff. What's going to be the easy stuff to graph? The fixed cost. Why? Because they're fixed. So what does a graph of fixed costs look like? If this is our output, based on how much we're producing. whatever we pick as our fixed costs, right? 10 million bucks, whatever. But it's fixed. So the idea is, even if you produce nothing, you're still going to have to pay this $10 million in fixed costs every month, every year, whatever that number is representing, right? This is our fixed cost. So then the question is, what does variable cost look like? All right, and this is where that graph, that table that I was starting to draw a little bit earlier, makes things look like, right? Initially, when you start people working, now imagine, if you will, that you're running, say, GM, right? And you have these big, huge factory lines that are producing cars, right? If you hired 10 people, and that's it, could they produce cars on the GM line? Yes, they could. But what would they have to do? They would sit down in one station, all 10 of them, figure out how that station works, and build the first part of the car. And then the car would shift to the next station. What do all those 10 people have to do? They shift down to the next station, and they have to figure out how the next station works. And they'll totally different machines.
I don't think those people would quit. You wouldn't stop one.
True, but if you're paying them enough, they'll stay, right? I mean, you give somebody $200 grand a year, they'll hop from station to station to station. That's exactly right. The idea, though, is that it costs them a lot to get going, right? And as they hire 20 people, so now they have, maybe there's 10 different stations. Now they're going to say, okay, the first 10 of you do the first 5 stations, the next 10, 5 stations. So that they only have to figure out how to, handle 5 different shifts, etc. So again, it's still going to cost you a lot of money, but now it's starting to be a little bit less because they're becoming a little bit more efficient. So what happens to variable costs is that initially they cost you a lot. Your costs go up and up and up and up and up. But eventually, as you hire more people, they start fitting into where you're going. And their actual addition to cost is not all that much based on the amount of output that you're cranking out, right? Once you get 10 people in each station, and that's what they belong at, right, your costs don't rise very much to produce more, right? All you have to do is tell them, well, if you just work 5 minutes more, you'll be able to crank out 5 extra cars per week. So, yeah, it doesn't cost you an extra. Maybe you pay them an extra 5 minutes worth of time. That's nothing, right? That's the idea behind it. Now, eventually, though, once you reach the maximum output of your factory, if you want to, increase your production, what do you have to start doing? You got to hire more people. And if you hire people for a second shift, what do you got to pay them? You got to pay them at least a 25% late shift bonus, right? Because nobody's going to work, 5 to midnight and not get paid more than the people who are working regular 8 to 5, right? So you're going to have to start paying them more, and now your variable costs start to shoot up. And if you want to hire even more, they keep shooting up and up and up and up. And at some stage, you reach the maximum capacity of your factory, right? I mean, if you've only got one line in your factory, and there's 100 people per line, yeah, you could run 3 different shifts, but could you run a 4th shift in there? You could try overlapping and sort of try this time shift while you're on and time shift while you're off. But does it work very well? No. Eventually, you just reach your capacity. The amount of money it spends to get more output is just ridiculous, all right? That's just not going to happen, all right? And now, if we want to add our fixed costs to our variable costs, what do we have to do? Take this number, add it to every one of those numbers. All right, now, I know that my graphs here suck, so what I'm going to have you do is go to page 120, where the real graphs are that have been drawn by a professional. This is fixed cost, this is variable cost, this is total cost. So total cost, fixed cost plus variable cost. All you're doing is taking this line and shifting it up by whatever the fixed costs are. So here's the way that the real, better drawn graph, I've made it a little bit more exotic with this very straight portion of it. Usually that portion is not that wide, but it could be theoretically. But this is very standard for what most total cost, variable cost production curves look like for a business that's producing, a lot of a particular product. All right? Now, these graphs, don't worry about them. This particular one, I'd show it to you once just so that you get an idea of how things are going, but I'm not going to ever quiz you on this particular graph. Unfortunately, the graph that's right next to it, we will be using forever and ever.
Oh, the one that has more lines.
Yes. And what does the graph right next to the total one look like? What is it titled as?
Cost per unit.
It's a more appropriate graph for what we really want to look at, because what really makes a difference for us is not totals. Totals are nice when you have to pay the bills. That's all you really care about. When you are really talking about how business works, you deal with average costs, not totals. All right? Because what you really want to say is, on average, how much does a car cost? And on average, how much am I paying my people? Right? So averages is where we really reel with the graphs that are important. And these are the sorts of things we're going to use a lot and a lot and a lot. Because if you have profit margins, you're not going to use totals. You're going to say, ooh, here's what my averages are, multiply my average times my quantity, that will give me total. All right? So please realize that average is really easily determinable once you've got total cost and quantity. The average yeah. This, if I put an A in front of TC, the A stands for average. So this is average total cost. Basically, take your total cost and divide by however many units you produced. That's how you calculate an average. Okay, so this is not deep math. It's basically calculate an average. So if you can have average total cost, guess what else you can have? Average fixed cost. And how would I define it? Yeah, just take each one of the actual ones that's an average of and divide by the quantity. So you could have average variable cost. You could have, oh, we've gotten to them all. And the nice thing about it is that the averages don't break the rule for the total, right? If you add up the averages, the total still equals the fixed plus the variable. I mean, this is a mathematical identity, which is nice. All right, so the graphs that I'm going to want you to be familiar with are actually the average variable and average total costs. Average fixed cost, please don't worry about this one. It's a graph. It's a line on the graph in that particular picture, but from after today, we will never deal with it ever again, okay?
Thank you.
Because it really doesn't play a part in what we're working with. And the cool thing about it is that if we have average total and average variable, we could always derive what average fixed is by just subtracting, right? So it's there, it's something that exists, and you'll calculate it once for homework, but after that, then we're going to throw it away, all right? So when we are dealing with costs, in general, we will deal with average total cost, average variable cost. Those are the two curves that I always want you to be able to graph yourself. Please realize that they are always this simple. They're just this smiley face. And the total is always on top of the variable, because total is more. Okay?
A really good question. The other
Yeah. Say production is output. And technically, there's averaged fixed cost, and it will always look like this, but please don't, like I said, don't worry about it, all right? It's there, but you will never use it after today. Now, the other thing that we have to worry about that's not on this graph yet is marginal cost, right? So I showed you what marginal output was, right? And again, marginal is how much does adding one additional input increase whatever it is that you're looking at, right? When it was marginal output or marginal product, we were looking at how much does one additional worker add to our output. When we're looking at marginal cost, it's if we add one more unit of production, if we add one more car that we're going to build, how much does that add to total cost, right? And the way business works is that while our average total cost is going down, our marginal costs are very, very, very small, right? So normally, until we get to this point where we're at a minimum point, right? This is a minimum. Does everybody understand why it's a minimum? Right. Okay, good. I'm just one of those making sure type things. And theoretically, average variable does the same thing. Here's its minimum. And the marginal cost is always a curve that's going to start below. As long as average total and average variable costs are going down, your marginal cost will be below it. Once these things are increasing, marginal cost grows. And marginal cost will always be the line that shoots way up there, all right? And again, mathematically, the reason behind this is that when averages are starting to go up, so if imagine if you're making 1,000 cars and the average cost of making that car is, $500. If you produce an additional car and the average goes up, for each car the average went up. How much did that last car that you make, how much more did it have to cost to drag the average of all the first 1,000 cars up? It had to be a lot, all right? That's why this marginal cost number or line is always shooting much higher, all right? I don't want to get too deeply into the math because then you guys will roll your eyes at me even more. But please realize these are the three curves that you will need to reproduce for the rest of the semester, okay? We will be looking at average total, average variable, and marginal on a regular basis, all right? All right. Well, we're basically out of time. So we got about 70% of the way through Chapter 6. We didn't quite get through as far as I would have liked, but that's okay. We are most of the way through Chapter 6. We'll finish it up Wednesday. If you want to start working on the Chapter 6 homework, you can. We haven't quite covered everything, but so not assigned yet. One of the questions in there, if you go back to the homework on page, you mean 128?
Yeah. Oh, 127.
127, 128?
Yeah, both of them.
If you will note on page 128, there's a big, huge table, right? Well, there's 27 and 28. The bigger one is on 28. 128 is where you basically fill in all of the numbers inside of this table. That will be a homework problem, all right? And basically it's utilizing the fact that total cost equals variable cost plus fixed cost and the definition for averages.
So you just fill in all the numbers?
Yeah, just fill in all the numbers. Again, we will go over examples of this next class, so bear with me to some degree. The quiz on Wednesday will cover Chapter 5 and potentially part of Chapter 6. So understand what the two types of costs are and the two types of profit are. And remember what total cost equals, variable cost plus fixed cost. And we will finish up this chapter and start in on Chapter 7